Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast on real or rendered, how we're going to utilize SOLIDWORKS Visualize to drive your products to the market. I'm Dave Janicki. I'm going to be presenting, but before we actually get started, I just wanted to let you guys know that you can submit any questions that you have as we're going throughout by typing them into that Q&A panel at any time. We have a moderator kind of checking them, and we'll answer them all at the end as we get them. Okay. Again, I'm David Janicki. I'm an application engineer in Grand Rapids, Michigan, mostly working in our SolidWorks side of things, whether it's PDM, Visualize, simulation, kind of a lot of the suites that we have going on in here. Before I was working in SolidWorks, I was doing a lot of continuous improvement in a little bit of the audio industry, and then into the electronic side of things. And that's just kind of a little bit about myself. So whether you're in Michigan or anywhere else in the country, glad to have you this morning. So probably the reason you're here is kind of to address maybe some limitations you might be experiencing with Visualize Standard, or if you haven't even used Visualize at all, to maybe understand what the capabilities are of the software itself and how you can actually use it to create some truly amazing content, either for internal purposes or for marketing purposes, right? So a lot of times when you're starting to create some of those animations, or I guess content inside of Standard, the problem I guess you might be running up to is it's all static images, right? Nothing's moving, nothing's really giving you that depth and feel for what you're actually trying to show. And in a day and age where virtual reality and everything is so quickly able to be spread, having a limitation always isn't that great. Along with that, a lot of times, whether, I guess it kind of depends what industry you're in, but there's a handful of different aspects inside of Professional where I can start to truly make my product look exactly how I want it to look and how people would actually expect it to appear when they're thinking about it in their mind, right, before they actually see what the picture is. Okay, so basically what we're going to do is walk through a handful of those things that are going to be able to be utilized inside of Professional, how they can be used, and what the results would actually look like, so you can get a real idea of some capabilities and kind of what you can expect with the software. Okay. So again, let's pretend you're new for just a second, right? Start to get an appreciation for what the software can actually do, right? So if I wanted to start getting some static images, this is a great way for customer-facing information, or even internal buy-off if you're trying to have some higher level sign-off on something that you want to create, to give them a truly good idea of what it is you're trying to produce. You get to create these pictures for them to see without actually having to produce any prototypes, what this is actually going to look like, right? So one thing I want to make sure and point out is, if you're using it, you are most certainly not alone, and if you're concerned about something along those lines, there's just a vast amount of companies using this. We've got your Fords, SpaceX's, Kohler, Under Armour, right? A lot of universities and colleges are using it as well. So there's a lot of very large companies that are utilizing this photorealistic rendering software to produce some of their marketing material, right? It's a great way to kind of shorten that production time down, where I can actually have that prototype without actually building the prototype, so people can get an idea of what this thing is going to look like before it's actually built, and kind of maybe fix some issues that they might see just from that standpoint, right? So that's kind of the goal for today, right? We're going to go through the handful of things that we can do inside of Professional, and maybe why it would be important to you. Okay, so large majority of the time, whenever people are starting to bump up to Pro, their biggest thing is saying, hey, I want to start animating things. I want to start having things move around. I want them to be able to kind of produce that good-looking image, right? So we're going to go ahead and show how different ways you can actually bring your products to life with animations, because it's not just your parts that you can animate. We can animate a handful of things, from part movement to appearances to your actual cameras, so I can have fly-throughs and realism in that way, right? So if you don't know, you can actually bump things over directly from SOLIDWORKS. So if I have a motion study, or if you're using the Make controller or Explode views, I can import those directly into my motion studies, which is going to help build a timeline for kind of the movement of my model, where I need to just play this thing through, see what it looks like, and kind of once that's done, I'm going to have an additional tab up here to export it directly to Visualize. So I do this Export Advanced, choose the motion study I want, I click OK, it just plays it through, and this is just to capture all the motion steps, so that when it gets over to SOLIDWORKS Visualize, and if you haven't seen it before, we're looking at the interface here of all that movement that's happening, right? So if I turn on my timeline, just use a Control L, I've now got all of that movement captured without me having to physically do anything inside of Visualize. It was all already captured inside of SOLIDWORKS and pushed over, right? So we're just scrubbing through, taking a look at kind of all those steps, and then maybe we'll go ahead and actually apply a couple of different appearances onto this thing, right? Make it look a little bit more realistic. You can quickly shift left click and then shift right click to copy and paste appearances. So again, if you're using the software, some quick little things to get you actually working faster. And then I'm going to come over here, and instead of doing a render, I'm going to click on this animation tab. Okay, and this is where I'm determining, what keyframes do I want to include, how many frames per second should I have, all of those render options that I typically want. So what's my size and resolution, and then my render passes. And now what I'm going to be doing as we go through this is I'm going to be kicking things off to what's going to be called our render queue. Okay, so if you're using standard right now, you probably know when I hit render, it renders it right then and there on my screen. I can't really do much of anything else because it's hammering my CPU, my GPU right then and there, right? So we'll show you what the render queue looks like at the end. I'm basically just going to be shooting it off to this the entire time. And then we're going to go ahead and run it, and then kind of get a glimpse of what that looks like, okay? So, again, I think I just did 100 passes or so on this. It's still a pretty clean image for I guess, the 1 minute worth of work I put into it to get it to that point. I've got a pretty nice model, and it didn't take all too long to actually render it. So that's the direct export from SOLIDWORKS. Now, if I just bring something in that's just a regular model, I can actually do a handful of things to animate this as well, right? So if I right-click on it and say Add Keyframe, and now I've got this timeline where I'm basically choosing, hey, over the course of X amount of time, and that's where I'm dragging that red bar, and that's my first keyframe on the left-hand side. And what I'll do is move my current cursor to another point in time, and in this point I'll say, hey, let's move it to 4 seconds. So what this is going to do is it's going to auto add a keyframe, and over the course of that 4 seconds, it'll move that stapler head from that starting position to that ending position, right? Now, in this case, that's not actually what I want to do. I basically want to pivot this thing, okay? So just so you can get appreciation for what that timeline's doing, we kind of can see what that looks like, right? So I just had to rechange the pivot point, which is a really simple thing to do. And I'm going to add another keyframe on here, right? So again, over the course of, let's say 2 seconds or maybe even 1.5 seconds, I'm going to want to pivot this thing up to that 90-degree point, right? And you can kind of see that keyframe got auto-added. I'm going to drag it over there again. I'm going to swivel it back down, right? That looks perfect. And that keyframe got added automatically. A lot of times when you're doing this stuff, it's easy to put it in that quick mode, so I don't have to actually, have things render every single time. Setting things up It's just a little bit easier when you're just in that very quick mode. Then again, I'm going to take this, bump it over to render out, make sure everything looks good, and we're going to send it off to that render queue. Okay, and again, what we're looking at here is that finalized copy with, I think, again, only 100 passes, but I could bump it up or maybe change that environment so it's not that HDR environment to kind of make it look a little bit cleaner, right? And then this gets into our next set of things, right? So we showed you can bump it straight from SolidWorks, you can move things on your own, or we can get into camera animations or even appearance animations. And appearance animations is one of the cooler things that I found, and we'll get into that here in a second. We can basically change the color of kind of what this water in the filter is going to look like. So if maybe I wanted to represent the water heating from, you know, cold to hot, I can actually do that, okay? So again, whatever I'm trying to animate, I'm going to want to right-click on it, go to that animation, say Add Keyframe. It's going to bump it down into that timeline, and then I can start to choose, hey, over the course of, you know, how many seconds do I want to do this now, right? I'm just going to kind of fit this camera to the spot I want it, and then go from there, okay? So again, before I do anything, I want to make sure and move my left cursor, or that yellow one, to the point where I want it to change at. I'm going to go ahead and click on that color and go to blue, right? And now over the next course of 3 seconds, I'm going to want it to now change from that blue to, let's say, an orange or a red, right? So if we go ahead and click out and bring it back to fast mode, you can see it a little bit cleaner, but if we play it, right, we can see over that course of time it's changing to blue, and then it actually goes from blue to orange, but it goes through that entire color spectrum. So it's a good smooth transition from that light blue to that orange, as opposed to just saying, hey, we're somehow randomly just getting blue to orange. So it's smart enough to understand, following that color spectrum and going from there, right? So now we'll actually get into camera animations, right? So whenever I'm doing camera animations, one thing I would just recommend is always just throw in a second camera. And you'll see why in a second here, why it's extremely helpful. I mean, it's not necessary, but it does make things a lot easier to edit and manipulate to the exact point you want. So again, I'll right-click on there on the camera, I'll say Add a Keyframe. It's going to put it at the beginning point, and I'm going to say, hey, over the course of 2.5 seconds here, or apparently 1.5 seconds or 2, I want to go ahead and do this 90-degree kind of swivel, right? And then over this next second here, I'm going to go ahead and zoom in to this point so I can really get a better look on my part, okay? And then over that last 3 seconds, let's again do another 180-degree turn, okay? So as we play through it, right, that's not exactly what I wanted, right? So that's where I either needed to add additional keyframes, and this is where that second camera is extremely helpful, because you can actually see the entire path that camera is supposed to be going from my second camera. And these little white boxes are actually those keyframes. So I can click on them, I can manipulate them, I can kind of move them as you normally would any part that you have, and I can add another keyframe in here to get that placement where I actually want it to go, right? So if I go ahead and click on it, we can go ahead and bump this thing into the exact position we want it to be. So now if we run through this, instead of it kind of going into hyperdrive and straight through my part, now it's instead doing that kind of clean swivel around to the exact position that I wanted it to, right? And a little bit more fine tuning, we could get it exactly where we want. You can start to fade things in and out a little bit cleaner. But again, once this thing's good and ready to go, I'll just check my settings and kick it off over to the render queue. Now, for things that are very standardized, like a 360 spin, you've just got the little icon for what's called a turntable at the top, and you can literally just have this thing set on that 360-degree spin and have it kind of repeat over and over again if you want to, right? So sometimes people will just have that full screen, they'll have the part fully rendered out, and just have that 360 spin kind of just continuing over and over so that people can kind of just glimpse at what it is that they're looking at, right? And again, this is kind of an example of that video, kind of a quick render out of it. I think it was, again, only 100 passes, but if I took the time to really dial in the lighting and dial in maybe my backgrounds, that could really produce a truly brilliant image there, right? So there's pretty much four prongs of that animation that we saw. We can shoot it straight over from SolidWorks. So if you're working with motion studies now, or if you use the Mate controller, or honestly something that people do a lot anyways already, which is like explodes or collapses even, those can be directly pulled into that motion study and then exported directly to Visualize. So you don't have to actually do any of that exploding in Visualize itself, okay? So it kind of saves that time and saves that, that struggle that sometimes occurs while doing it inside of Visualize, okay? So if you wanted to, though, obviously that ability to do it inside of Visualize is still there, where I can, you know, change my pivot points for specific groups, or I can add things together and go from there. And then we've got our camera animations if I want to do fly-throughs, or even your standardized 360 spins, right? And then at the end there, right, we showed changing that water from that clear to blue to red, right? So I can change kind of the full spectrum of color of whatever my appearance currently is, okay? Now, kind of going hand in hand with that is me wanting to, again, bring my products to life and kind of more immerse myself into whatever it is that I see in front of me, right? So this is where virtual reality and what are going to be called panoramics are going to come into play. Virtual reality can be done a couple of different ways inside of Visualize, and we'll get into kind of those different exports that you can actually do with it. But the first thing we're going to do is going to be what's called an interactive image. So this is maybe if you want to put something online, have people be able to open it in a browser, spin it around, take a look at all the angles of it. What I do, though, is just make sure that nothing is clipping in my view frame, and then come to my render tab, go up to that regular render, and then change the output mode instead to an interactive image. And inside of here, what I'm doing is determining, kind of if you're thinking about your 0 point, I've got my start angle and my end angle that I'm viewing, and then we've got these orbits and images per orbit, right? So just think orbits as kind of that vertical steps from that 15 to 45 degree point, and then your images per orbit is that 360 degree spin. How many images am I going to have as that image kind of turns around? And just so you can kind of hopefully understand what it is that I'm trying to picture here. We've got an example of it where in that frame, right, we'll go ahead and spin this thing around, right? So that's image, and it's just that 12 images per one single orbit, okay? And a lot of times you can kind of get everything it is that you need inside of there. So aside from that, a lot of times when you're thinking about virtual reality, it's more for interior things, right? It's when I'm inside of somewhere, and in this case, we've got a little brewery here, right? A little smaller scale, but in-home brewery, and this is where, again, you want to have a second camera just so you can see where that placement of your panoramic camera is going to be. But you can actually export it off as that mono, the stereo 2-up, or the stereo anaglyph. And what that is basically stereo 2-up is just for your left and right eye if you put on that VR goggles, and then the stereo anaglyph is if you're thinking about the colors, like when you have 3D, like blue and red glasses. That's kind of what that's doing. So we're instead taking that output mode and kicking it off to what's called panoramic. Again, I'm going to just check my things here, make sure everything, all my specifications look good, and then we can kick that thing off to the queue and end up with an image that looks like this, right? So it's basically going to just go ahead, shoot you down in here, and now I can spin around. So you can actually add additional camera points. So right now I only had one, but you can have additional camera points where it's in other locations so that you can kind of snap to those different locations. You can look around, zoom in. but I do want to kind of be upfront and say it's not really one of those virtual realities where I can physically walk around in and kind of get to those points, right? It's more of I've got these preset camera points that I can click to and kind of view those points and zoom in from there and swivel around. Okay. So again, took a look at two things there, right? We got those interactive online images, or I guess just interactive images in general, right? I can click on something, spin it around, really get a feel for what it is that I'm looking at. And then there's that virtual reality capability, either through your browser, which we were looking at, or you've got basic capabilities for any virtual reality headset. So even if you've got one of those Google Cardboards, that's something you can use with these outputs, right? So it's really capable for anyone who's really trying to use it to go ahead and use it. There we go. So this brings us to that next point of trying to actually take some of those, again, if you're using Visualize Standard at this point, take those images and just really bring them to that next level of clarity, right? So it's kind of counterintuitive because we're going to be talking about blurring, all right? But as we get into it, you'll kind of understand what I'm talking about by further level of clarity or further level of kind of enhancement of what the image looks like. So whenever I'm doing a blur, what I first need to do is actually add an animation to what it is I want to blur, and it's going to be a rotation animation. Whenever I add one of these, it'll be found in my timeline, and there's going to actually be a handful of properties for me to play around with for that specific group of parts or that part itself. Okay, so I'm kind of just choosing what that axis of rotation is going to be, more or less where I want it to blur from. And then over that course of time, I'm just setting my total rotation for the timeline itself, right? So that over that 4.5 seconds, it's going to rotate 720 degrees, right? So to actually make the motion blur captured in my camera, I need to come over to that advanced tab for the camera and come down here and enable my motion blur, right? And what I can do with this is actually tinker around with my shutter time itself. And we'll show you an example of what changing that shutter time is actually going to do to the image itself. Okay, we're going to send that thing again off to the queue. I'm just going to change the digit here again, shoot it off again, and we'll go ahead and be good. So again, just to get an example of what we're talking about with changing that shutter speed, right? Here's what it looks like being done at 17 milliseconds. And then 5 milliseconds. So it's kind of a little less blurred the lower that is, as opposed to kind of the higher that is, right? Okay. Aside from that, though, if you've got something like Photoshop for post-processing, a lot of times some of that stuff that you're trying to do can be just done in here. Sometimes you're just trying to maybe capture some enhanced lighting or darken the image, but we also have a bunch of preset filters to choose from. Maybe not a bunch, but there's about 6 or 7 of them. So I can do my typical black and white. You get your sunsets, fades, and what's actually doing is changing all those settings on that right-hand side to fit whatever it is you need. So honestly, you can Google a lot of these filters, find out what the vignette, the darken, the lighten, all that information is, and just directly input it into your right-hand side to get whatever filter it is, more or less, you're trying to do. Okay. And again, that's kind of just trying to take away one additional step in that process, right? So I wanted a black and white miter saw. Here we go. That thing looks fantastic, right? A large part of what you're doing, though, and a large part of the limitation in standard is the customizability or the ease of adding in lighting, right? So we've got these HDR environments that you can easily drag and drop in there. And what they're doing is they're adding in the lighting that's being actually captured when the picture is taken, and it's putting in that background image. So I can turn that background image off and still have the lighting itself being applied to my part, right? So you can kind of see that blue shimmer on the part. Then I can put in whatever backplate it is that I truly wanted into here. Okay. So if you wanted to almost kind of create your own HDRs. You could take your camera that's HDR capable out into the field, do that 360 spin, capture all that lighting, and bring it in here, right? But we can also add additional lights by either picking the target, picking the position, or saying, hey, I want the light to start from where my camera is, right? So I said pick position, and it actually went ahead and it placed that light, that plane light, what it's called, right there, okay? So now what I can do with this in Pro is actually move and manipulate this thing in a very clear and concise way, where it's almost another 3D model for me to manipulate, okay? So I can choose kind of how large that is, and I can choose from a handful of different lights as well. So whether it's, directional, spotlight, sphere light, I can get all of these things put in there and really start to capture the specific lighting that I'm wanting. So if you have a backplate that you already have, and you now need to match additional lighting onto your model for that backplate, this allows you to do it a lot easier in a lot more flexible way. You can also use HDR Light Studio, so if you have that, that's another way for you to manipulate your lighting and really pinpoint that in there, right? Just figured I'd say it because some people will end up knowing about it and kind of how it can be done, right? So again, just a rendered off miter saw, kind of showing what that lighting could potentially look like. Okay, so again, you saw what that realistic blur of rotation looks like. You can do for movement, and ultimately this could potentially reduce the need for a post-processor like your Photoshops. Obviously you can't really remove colors or do anything like that from it, but if you're just trying to kind of highlight what it is that things are looking like or add vignettes, this kind of can cut back the need for an additional software there, right? Now another big thing that people end up doing in Pro is going to be just that quick change of colors, right? So I don't want to have a project for the 20 different versions of the colors that I use on one single product, right? So it's kind of a little bit different than configurations inside of SolidWorks. You're going to be found up here, and it's literally just kind of for colors, right, for my appearances themselves. So I'm just going to add a couple of these configurations, right? It's just from that drop down, I can move plus sign, and I'm going to go ahead and create these additional configurations, okay? Now inside of here, what I'm doing is I've got this color already applied in these handful of places. So what I'm going to want to do though is go ahead and copy and paste that color so that it's an individual appearance in that list. Now I'm going to go ahead and change it to whatever color it is I want. So we're going with that green. I can then drag it, drop it onto there, and now that configuration is my green configuration. And I can keep doing this for, right, we've got our purple version. And we're going to go ahead and click, or it froze up on me here. Okay, here we go. So right, we're gonna add that purple version here, and then finally we'll jump to another configuration, and maybe we want to make it look a little bit different, really add something in that's unique. Maybe we want this thing to just be shiny as possible and just made of chrome, so super robust and to that point. Okay, so with those 4 configurations, instead of me having to go up and click, hey, let's open that file, render it out, open that file, render it out, etc. Instead of output mode, I can just come to all configurations, set what I want, and then send it off to the queue, or render it right there again. I mean, it depends on really what you want, right? But it just allows for really good flexibility and quickly adding some different color schemes or some additional appearance types, and then rendering it off all at once without having to change your environment, without having to redoing your lighting, without really having to redo much of anything. It's just kind of a quick and easy way to do that, right? So we can kind of see, hey, we've got these 4 different versions. You know, which one do I actually like? Okay. So as you can kind of see there, we were able to kind of see that perfect appearance prior to production. And then the beauty of that configuration itself is that ability to kind of give those realistic previews of our choices, right? A lot of times, you know, higher ups just want to say, hey, what else can this thing look like? Or, you know, is this really the best option we have? Okay. So again, kind of wrapping this thing up. I know we're coming close to that 30-minute mark here. So taking a look at what's called that render queue though, right? So as I've been doing things, I've been shooting it over to this render queue. And what that's going to do for me is just start a big list of all the things, whether it's renders or animations. It's going to give me a list of all those things that I'm trying to produce, right? So what I can basically do is I can kick this stuff off all throughout the day. You know, it's time to go home. All I do is click that Start Queue button, and it goes ahead and works for me, right? So I'll just end up clicking it, and it's just going to run through everything overnight. Even if something fails for whatever reason, it's just going to keep going down the line. It's not going to try and keep doing something that's failing. It's just going to kind of work its way through. Okay. One additional thing I want to point out that you actually get a license of with Visualize Pro is called what's Visualize Boost. So that's if I wanted to actually have some other computers kind of power my rendering. You can buy a handful of licenses of Boost and actually use that to kind of power your imaging, right? So again, that render queue is one of the larger reasons people end up bumping up, because instead of having to render things in the middle of the day when I'm trying to get things done, I can have it all work overnight and kind of basically work for me while I sleep, right? So just one thing I want to do before we get into the Q&A is real or rendered, right? Looking at this image, it is actually a rendering of this little blender or whatever it is here. So again, we're looking at this drill. A lot of times when you go into the hardware store now, you'll be looking at all these pictures, trying to figure out, hey, is this thing actually made or is it a render? And in this case, it is, again, a render. And then finally, we got this beautiful room. We got, you know, I don't know, was that a 70-inch TV hanging out up there, light coming into the siding. Again, this is something that's just rendered, right? I'm applying those appearances to my model, making it look exactly how it is that I want it to look, applying that lighting on exterior, and going from there, okay? If you do have a 3D mouse right now, they're totally awesome for Visualize. I'll go ahead and say that. It makes it very easy to scale your part and move things around and get into some of those camera animations. It kind of makes things just as easy as you'd think inside of SolidWorks, right? It's just really handy. So this I always just like to make sure everybody realizes, if you're already on SolidWorks Pro or Premium, you've got a license or Visualize Standard. Okay, that is one of the most important things I like to tell everyone, because I found too many times where people just don't know and they're like, oh my gosh, this would have been fantastic. And then that boost, where it's that network rendering, is included. One license is included with Professional. Okay, so right, just to recap, what you're getting in Visualize Pro is a lot of those things to take your products to the next level, right? So do I want to see what the inside of a room feels like, what it looks like, you know, start to kind of move around it, get that exterior virtual reality. So how do I interact and move around my part? And then a large part is, again, those animations, right? Do I want to just bump something straight over from SolidWorks? Do I want to move things individually, move those cameras, or even change colors of appearances, okay? And then finally, you know, obviously we talked about it, kicking off to that render queue, saving you time during your workday when you're most efficient, and sending that stuff off overnight, right? So that's going to conclude the presentation portion of our webcast.